Hi. This week, in week 6, we're going to explore sex and gender. Now, this is often a really challenging chapter for a number of different reasons. We're going to look at sex, which is the biological dimension, and we're going to look at gender, which is the cultural or socially constructed dimension. Very different. They are not the same thing. They are not interchangeable. Sex and gender are two separate concepts that often get interchanged, and they're not. Sex is a constant, gender is fluid. Not all countries have the same description and the same understanding of what gender is and what it stands for and how it represents men and women. So we're going to look at that. We're going to consider gender stratification from a historical perspective. Really what we're going to be doing is looking at a quick overview at looking at humans over the last, say, 15 to 30,000 years and how gender stratification became a part of the human structure in human society. It hadn't always been. We're also going to look at gender and gender socialization, how it is that we learn to be masculine or learn to be feminine. Societal standards are different for different societies. Then we'll look at the contemporary gender inequality. This can become a difficult chapter because other times within many societies that men typically don't really recognize gender inequality and women typically do. It's largely because in most societies men don't experience gender inequality. And that's oftentimes why they don't always understand it. But we're going to explore it sociologically. We're going to look at the issues of gender inequality within this class. And I also want you to consider outside of Canada as well. Gender inequality exists everywhere. It's not just a North American phenomenon. Some questions to consider. What effect does gender inequality have on women? Or, for that matter, on men? How is it different in different societies? What do a society's resources or economic structures do to influence this stratification between men and women? How does a government contribute to this disparity? What role of other society resources does family play a role? Religion, economy, do all contribute to this gender stratification that exists in different degrees throughout the world? What are the primary agents of socialization? So, who do we learn how to be masculine and feminine from in any given society? We are a part of society that has constructed two genders, men and women. There are other societies that have more than two genders, as many as 5 different genders. Because remember, it's socially constructed, it's not based in biology. And lastly, how does the contemporary workplace reflect gender stratification? We're going to look at the wages and distribution of who works where and under what circumstances. All right, so this is a fun chapter. It's also an interesting one because even though we all fit into a gender category, but do we all accept these gender categories without much thought? We're going to think about it today. Good luck.
As mentioned earlier, now we're looking at sex and gender, and we're going to look at the first dimension of this, which would be sex. Now, when we talk about this, we mean it in terms of the biological dimension. Now, what we're looking at here, it's the biological and anatomical differences between males and females, which comes down to the chromosomes, essentially. XX is female, and XY is male. Now, along with this, of course, comes primary sexual characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics. And within primary sexual characteristics, we include the genitalia, which is used for reproductive purposes. Now, noticing what I'm talking about here is biological, keeping it very biologically focused, which is basically saying that this isn't about how we distinguish between masculine and feminine. This is how we distinguish between male and female. Now, the primary sexual characteristics are not always as black and white as genitalia for reproductive purposes. Secondary sexual characteristics, these are the physical traits that identify an individual's sex. This would be things like breasts, hips, pubic hair, larger physical size in males and such. Now, these are the biological dimensions. Now, it's not just that black and white. We have examples of people who are hermaphrodites and transsexuals. Now, by definition, now these are sociological definitions. You'll find that in abnormal psychology, you might have slightly different definitions. A hermaphrodite is a person in whom sexual differentiation is ambiguous or incomplete. That is to say, they aren't completely male and they aren't completely female according to primary and sexual characteristics. And they may have some ambiguity, some variation in between. Now, transsexual, this is a person whom the sex-related structures of the brain that define gender identity are opposite from the physical characteristics and the physical sex organs of the person's body. Now, there are different examples or different makeups, transvestites. Now, this is something you will find in a psychological disorder in abnormal psychology, and this is where a person, male typically, who lives as a woman, or a female who lives as a man, but does not alter their primary sexual characteristics. Neither do they have that as any interest. They're not finding themselves with, say, if you will, a female brain in a male's body. Now, Brachis, if you look at the video that I posted for the journal, this is biological males who behave, dress, and work as females, and you'll find other examples of biological females who will dress and work as males, and they're treated in those particular genders. Now, when we can look at transsexuals in terms of North America, we see lots of examples of people, whether they be celebrity, as in Caitlyn Jenner or Bono there in the top, but the other examples are also of transitioned males or transitioned females. And these would be people who have had sexual reassignment where their brain chemistry and brain makeup, if it were male or female, seems to more line up with who they see themselves being. And so it's very complicated. The sexual dimension is not as straightforward. Transgender are those who appear both in terms of how they look, their behavior, and or their self-identification that doesn't conform to the social rules of gender. So this would be an example. These people here on the screen are examples of transgender. People who don't feel themselves in the right body, who go about making changes biologically to themselves to match better. Now, when we talk in terms of other dimensions, in terms of the biological dimension, there is the issue of sexual orientation, where when you think in terms of orientation, there's three key criteria for defining homosexuality. And one of them is the sexual attraction to a person of their own sex. And two is the sexual involvement with a person of their own sex. But as importantly, if not more so importantly, is the self-identification. That is, seeing oneself in that way. And so when we have examples of people who don't agree with these sorts of orientations, then we have what's called homophobia, or the extreme prejudice directed at gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and others who are perceived as not being heterosexual. Now, what's important to recognize, and we'll touch on this in the next slide, is that sex is biological in its dimension. When we look at the next dimension, we're looking at cultural dimension, gender. In cultural dimension, what is meant by this is that gender is culturally and socially constructed. There's a difference between males and females that are found in the meanings, beliefs, and the practices associated with femininity and masculinity. And because cultures around the world don't see masculinity and femininity in precisely the same way, therefore they define things according to the way that they see masculinity and femininity within their culture. Now, there are some special terms. When we think in terms of cultural and about gender role, you were looking at things that could fit within what is the attitude, the behaviors, and the activities that are socially defined as appropriate for each sex and are learned through a process, a socialization process. So you're seeing a list of masculine and feminine stereotypes. Now, for some people, this would start to represent some of the gender roles that we are taught both in our family, within our peers, within schools, within religion, within society, that this is what it is to be female and this is what it is to be masculine and male. Now, these can change over time, and gender identity is what is a person's perception of themselves as female or male. So related to gender identity is body consciousness, about how a person perceives and feels about his or her body. It includes an awareness of social conditions in society, and it contributes to one's own self-knowledge. Now, gender institutions are where gender is one of the ways in which social life is organized into sectors in society. And then there is what we would describe as gender belief systems, and these include all the ideas regarding masculine and feminine attributes that are held to be valid in a society. And these do change over time. If you look at homosexuality as an example, that used to be viewed, or those people who fall within those orientations used to be viewed as having a medical condition. Now, of course, today, it's nothing in that genre at all. In fact, it's much more accepted, at least in Canada and in some parts of the United States and other parts of the world. Now, when we think, again, about sex and gender, one of the things that jumps up at us is what's known as sexism. And this is the subordination of one sex, usually the female sex, based on the assumption of superiority by another sex. Now, this is an important point to be bringing out, because when we talk about superiority, it's like looking at the discussion about minority and majority. That the superiority of the majority group, seems to have power over the minority. And yet, when you look at the differences between men and women, that difference genetically is so minute. It's extremely small. Less than 1% of the genetic material makes what is a woman, and makes what is a man. And yet it makes such a big difference in the way we do see each other, but it's socially constructed about who has what authority and what power over what gender. And so sexism is this subordination of one on the assumption, and it's important to recognize that it's an assumption of superiority. Now, what gets involved here, of course, is typically negative attitudes towards women, stereotypical belief that reinforce, complement, or even justify prejudice and discrimination. Interwoven in sexism are terms that we call, the bottom left says, father knows best. This is based on a system that's known as patriarchy, a hierarchical system of social organization in which a culture, politically and economically, structures are all controlled by men. And if you look at businesses, you look at politics and leadership, you'll find predominantly men. The household is still considered by many of society that it's a male-dominated system, the family. The father is the head of the household, makes the money, earns the wages, makes the decisions. Now, that's not necessarily straight across the board the way it is, but it does lend itself to say that these are also fluid. So things do change over time. Now, matriarchy, girls rule is the signature there. This is where the hierarchy system of social organization, culturally, politically, and economic structures are controlled by women. Now, that doesn't happen in very many cultures in the world. But it has existed, and it still does exist to a much smaller degree than patriarchy. Now, if we look at it from a sort of where did this shift, or movement of gender stratification, the way we view men and women over, how has it developed over time? Well, we can look at, this division of labor, men's work and women's work. Where did it come from? How did it start? And there's several factors that are important in determining the gender division of a society. Now, one is the subsistence base. Now this really just means that how does a society gain basic necessities like food, shelter, and clothing? A second issue is the supply of and the demand for labor. And the third around the division of labor that's on the lines of gender is the extent to which women's child rearing interferes or affects the practices and the compatibility of certain kinds of labor. So let's go back in time and we can look at the earliest formations of how man, and I should say how humans interacted. And we can go back to hunting and gathering, where the basic theme here was that men hunted for game and women gathered roots and berries. It's relatively equitable, the relationship between men and women at this particular time. Both roles were important to the success of the society. Women are full economic partners with men, and there's very little social stratification. Now, if we move into the earlier the times following hunting and gathering, we entered into the horticultural period. Horticultural people were able to grow their own food, and women's economic contributions were compatible with childcare was vital. It's fairly high degree of gender equality existing because neither sex controls the food supply. When we started to move towards pastoral, this is domestication of animals to provide food. Herding is done primarily by men. Women contribute relatively to the subsistence production of foods in such societies. They do a lot of the growing, and women, their primary value is their ability to bear children. And we start to see this distinction between men and women and what they provide to the overall benefit of a society. The third sort of period of time, if you will, is an agrarian, which is about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, and we still see examples of each of these sort of societies in today's world. This is where gender inequality and male dominance became more institutionalized, if you will. The economy is agriculturally based, where its strength, and men being the stronger, were involved in the food production. Women were seen as more the caregivers and looking after and raising and having children. When we move from agrarian into the more industrial period, society which factories or mechanized production has replaced agriculture as the major economic base. As societies industrialized, the status of women declined further. The division of labor between men and women became more distinct. A cult of domesticity, or a cult of the true woman, was established around these periods, where women were natural keepers of the domestic sphere. The effect of this was the economic and political subordination of women. Now, this is all emerging around the 1700s, when the advent of the plow and the steam engine started to emerge, and the mechanization of more and more of what we see today of industrialization, factories and such. And then lastly is what's known as the post-industrial, ones in which technology supports a service. The information-based economy, it's also known as. Formal education is essential, and this will change the gender division of labor. Or you could ask that question, is that going to change the division of labor? And in some respects, yes. More women have access to power via education. In fact, in today's world, more women attend post-secondary than do men. And in fact, more women are entering into what's known as STEM, science, technology, or engineering and mathematics, at a higher rate than do men. You could also say, no, it doesn't help, because higher power is still in the hands of men. The effects on the family, well, we have dual earner families, which is becoming the norm, with about 80% of adult women in the workforce caring for children and a partner, and aging parents, as well as meeting with the demands of work, places strain in women's lives, issues of female-headed household, double burdened with income and paid responsibilities. It's arguable as to whether or not women are getting a more balanced representation and more balanced responsibilities and authority within society. Now, we can take this further and sort of look at, well, if these existing separations between men and women do exist, how does this get perpetuated? Can't just be in the division of labor. There must be some other agents at play. And so then we can start looking at some of the cultural dimensions, and in particular, we can look at socialization. And we can start with gender socialization by parents. Boys and girls are seen differently. Children, well, their clothing, their toys reflect this. Boys are encouraged not to participate in girls' games. Chores in the home vary for girls as it does for boys. Girls tend to be caring for siblings and domestic responsibilities, and boys tend to be engaged in computer games and work outside. Now, some parents purposely encourage opposite gender play roles in order to sort of create a better balance. And we certainly will say that over the years, gender, well, it is fluid in society. And so some of the shifts that we see in what women do and what women see as women's work and what men see as men's work is changing. Although it's still something that is very entrenched in the way that we engage with our children. Now, peer and gender socialization, well, same-sex groups are most common in early education. Children are more accepted by peers if they conform to gender stereotypes. In adolescence, peers become even stronger. Male bonding is to encourage male identity. The evidence for gender bullying in school really does exist based on whether or not you meet or don't meet certain expectations and conform. You can also look at the schools, teachers, schools, and gender socialization, that during the early years of education, a teacher is very powerful. Evidence for unintentional gender bias occurs. Well, gender bias such as showing favoritism towards one gender over another. Some of the examples include teachers will tend to devote more time and effort and attention to boys rather than girls. And this might be in part due to behavioral issues, but nonetheless, the amount of time spent with boys is greater than that of girls. The effect of this not only is it affecting learning, but it's affecting self-esteem and the frequency setting for sexual harassment. Yet there are more women in undergraduate education than men. Specialization in professions, we got more and more women than men that have degrees now. Now, a huge area for gender socialization is still mass media, movies, music videos, all sorts of things, including magazines. Media is a powerful source of gender stereotyping. Now, you're seeing two examples here. This is women's health and men's health, and both of them are looking at how important abs are, but look at how differently they're dressed. Look at some of the other topics. Rock her socks off. It's about men and the roles that they can have with women and having their way with women. And if you look at, she wants to send you sexy selfies. Well, look at what's in the women's. It's about looking nice. It's about looking great. It's about making yourself look good, maybe for yourself, but also for men. And we see this gender bias that more men than women, more men are more aggressive than women. Soap operas are classic media formats for gender stereotyping. In advertising, you see it where people accept traditional gender stereotypes because they work. Advertisers wouldn't advertise the way they do if people weren't buying the product. And so from an advertiser's perspective, using gender stereotypes is money-making because people do respond to it. Whether we talk to one another about how wrong it is or not, if we're buying product, then we support the method by which it's being communicated to us. And lastly, in this particular part, we're going to look at some of the contemporary gender inequality that exists. More gender segregation in the paid workforce. Gender wage gap. pay equity and employment equity, and paid work and family work. If we start with gender segregated work, the concentration of women and men in different occupations, jobs, and places of work. Women continue to be more represented in clerical work, while men in the natural sciences, engineering, and mathematics. Now, we will start to see that to change as we see more women getting graduating colleges and universities and carrying on into STEM research. If we carry on into what's known as the gender wage gap, this is the ratio of earnings between men and women. The disparity between a woman and a man's earnings. In 2002, women make about 70% that of what men make. Marital status makes a difference. A single, never married woman makes about 94%, whereas a married woman makes about 65%. So it's important when we see about what the role, the wage gap is different. We had, and we'll see this a little bit later, pay equity in Canada, and that was put out in 1982, I think. And that was put out in order to establish more balance between men and women doing the same work with the same education to get the same pay. And that was in 82, and here we are in 2017, and women aren't making any, are still making 70% that of which men make. We can also look at pay equity and employment equity. Pay equity is a comparable worth. This reflects the belief that wages ought to reflect the worth of the job, not the gender or race of the worker. Employment equity, this is a strategy to eliminate the effects of discrimination and to fully open the competition for job opportunities to those who have been excluded historically. Now, some of the targets for these strategies include visible minorities, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, and women. Other related issues to this include recruitment, selection, training, development, promotion, conditions of employment, and layoffs. This is to say that all the reasons why those things need to happen or are happening can't reflect gender. It must reflect competency, the way a person does the job itself, not the gender of the person doing the job. And lastly, but not less important, in family sociology, it's another course that I teach, we spend a fair bit of time looking at this area of, and it'll happen towards the end of the semester, looking at the issue of paid work and family work and the relationship between the two. Paid work or for wages or a salary is one thing. Family work is unpaid work such as the housework, the child care of parents and kin. The norm is that the married woman combines both paid and family work. The division of labor for family work has not essentially changed over time. Women still do the bulk of the family work. In fact, there's a term that's been used to describe that women do what's called the double day or the double shift or the second shift, and this is where they have the dual responsibility of being employed as well as looking after the children, making the meals, and caring for her husband. Couples without children, women do 60% of the family work. Couples with children, women do even more. And then you add to this other factor, something that's been emerging over the last 20 years, is what's known as the family, a sandwich generation. And this is where families, middle-aged families, have their own children that they're raising, but they also have parents who are living longer to be looking after. And so it's known as the sandwich generation. They're caught between the needs of their own young children and their elderly parents. And a lot of this responsibility also falls on the women's shoulders. Now, this has been an introduction to sex and gender, and like I've said in previous, and I will continue to say throughout this semester, this is not universal to being that this is the only way that it's been seen, that all this gender differences occurs only in North America. This happens all over the world, but it's different all over the world. And so, this brings to the end the part 1. Part 2 will begin, and you'll find we'll look at theories most notably and the future of where some of this research into gender and sex is going. All right, let's carry on. Keep up the good work.